So, Lord Patten, welcome to Stanford.
Thanks very much. I've been here before. I've lectured a couple of times at the Hoover Institute, where I think they were slightly nervous about my own brand of conservatism. But I survived in one piece, survived long enough to go and do two of the lakeside talks at Bohemia Grove. So I've been through every sort of anthropological excitement imaginable in North California.
Well, we appreciate you hopping across the pond to join us again today. And whilst we're spoilt with many guests throughout the year, few have been involved in so many historical moments as your good self, nor worked with so many leaders ranging from Thatcher through to the Pope. So we've got quite a lot to cover, but I'll try and take a whistle-stop-store through it all. And perhaps, given that the audience is Stanford students, we can start with your role as the Chancellor of Oxford. And how you, given that it's such a historical, old educational institute, how you are ensuring to keep it relevant and that it continues to attract top global talent?
First of all, a word about the role. Oxford is the oldest university in Britain, though not the oldest in Europe, or indeed in Europe and Africa. I suppose the oldest in Europe or Africa is Fez, and the oldest in Europe probably Bologna or Paris. But we're pretty old. We're getting on for 900 years. We have a college which the professor was out called New College, and it's called New College because it was founded in the 15th century, 13th century. So it's very, very new. My old college was founded in the 12th century, and it celebrates its 800 or 850th anniversary about every 2 years. It's a way of making money. There've been a lot of chancellors over the years. I do point out that at Cambridge, 3 of their chancellors have been executed and 1 has been canonized, whereas at Oxford, 3 have been canonized, only 1's been executed. So we've done rather better. These days, the chancellor is elected by all graduates. I'm only the 4th since 1935. Lord Halifax, who was ambassador in the States and foreign secretary in 35. Harold Macmillan, who was prime minister in 1960. Roy Jenkins, who was president of the European Commission and probably the greatest reforming interior home secretary in our politics since the war in 1983. And I was elected in 2003. The job is elected for life. I used to say like the Pope, but I can't say that anymore. So like the Dalai Lama. I probably can't say that if there are any Chinese representatives present, but and the job is one surrounded by mystery. Roy Jenkins, my predecessor, used to say it was one in which impotence was assuaged by magnificence. His predecessor, Harold Macmillan, who was a sort of Edwardian intellectual, used to offer a more metaphysical explanation. He used to say, well, as you know, the Vice-Chancellor actually runs the university, but if you didn't have a Chancellor, you couldn't have a Vice-Chancellor. So I'm like a sort of ceremonial monarch. I'm a constitutional monarch. Lots of ceremonial stuff, lots of fundraising. I chair selections of new Vice-Chancellors and generally try to make a pain of myself with governments if they're not supportive enough of the university. The most important thing for us to do at Oxford is to ensure that we remain a terrific teaching institution. George Kennan, who I think is one of the great princes of the American Republic, George Kennan said that the teaching at Oxford he thought was incomparable. And even though it's expensive, we have to try to keep it that way with our tutorial system. And we have to make sure that we are still pushing the boundaries of knowledge as far forward as possible. Our medical sciences division, dare I say this in Stanford, has come top of the global league tables for 5 years running now. Our math and engineering have got better and better. One of our senior mathematicians won the Abel Prize this year. And humanities at Oxford are terrific. I would like them to be even better. And I'm particularly concerned at the moment that while we can still raise quite easily, with a bit of effort, funding for scholarships for graduate studies in sciences and medicine, it's much more difficult to do so in the humanities. And that is because, partly I think, because of the disgraceful way in which universities tend to be judged in almost a utilitarian fashion these days, rather than for more general considerations. To find myself as Chancellor occasionally having to make speeches justifying teaching the humanities is a bit annoying, but as I always say, we teach the humanities because we're human. So my job is to try to ensure that people continue to deliver the quality of teaching we require and the quality of research. We've just appointed a new Vice-Chancellor who's Irish-American, Trinity College Dublin, UCLA, no one's perfect, Harvard, she was one of Drew Faust's protégés and she was executive dean of the School of Advanced Studies there. Then ran St Andrews in the UK, where she, among other things, had to take on the Royal and Ancient Golf Club. And what I will not say, because I think it's slightly offensive, so I won't make the point that she's the first woman who's ever been Vice-Chancellor of Oxford, but she is, and she's absolutely terrific. A great expert on international security, and has written, I've spent quite a lot of my life in politics dealing with terrorism, and I think she's written the best academic studies of how to deal with terrorism that I've read by anyone.
So on the topic of progressing ideas, and as we move to what many are calling, a new innovation economy and a knowledge-based economy, Silicon Valley is especially well placed to do so. But I don't think London's too far behind, considering we've now got our own little bubble of San Francisco. It's essentially Silicon Valley, New York, and Washington in one. But as we strive to adopt new technology and innovation, what hurdles do you think remain for London and the UK to progress and become a little bit more like Silicon Valley?
Well, I think there are two basic ones. First of all, if British politicians aren't worried about the standard of math in our secondary schools, they should be. Secondly, I think that we don't have as natural and innovative culture as exists in the United States. I was interested yesterday, one of the young, he was then a young undergraduate who helped to organize my campaign for governor of, not even that, the last job I had for Chancellor of the university. He was at the reception we had last night in Palo Alto, and I said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And he said, "I'm now the economic, now I head the economics department at Google." And terrific that he's here, but I wish he was doing something to promote innovative culture in the UK. So I think we lack the same innovative culture, and we haven't made some of the investments which would have helped to make us even more competitive. For example, there is an obvious requirement for a corridor, a technology and transport corridor between Oxford and Cambridge, which together are formidable, with a growing and successful record of spin-off, with a lot of shared interests. And I think that the governments in the United Kingdom have been pathetic over the years in investment. I don't think infrastructure investment has been a great story in the United States, since probably President Eisenhower, but that's perhaps another matter. But I think infrastructure investment, improving the level of basic math in schools, and trying to do more to promote innovation. I don't think myself that has as much to do with the tax system as some right-wing politicians think, but there are other things you can do to promote that culture, I suspect.
I'll skip over the topic of taxes, and on it's interesting around how this innovation has been progressive in many ways, and yet the gap between the rich and the poor seem to be increasing over time. How do you think we can reconcile this progression in a more sustainable manner and bring everyone else along?
I think that's very interesting, and I guess profoundly relevant to what's happening in your own domestic politics, on which I'll be blessedly almost silent, but also on ours as well. There's a very good book which I read recently. I think it's called Concrete Economics, or Concrete Reality, which makes the point that it's a complete fiction that wealth and prosperity have always been created in the United States by the private sector, that the government has always been a drag. Not true. You start with Alexander Hamilton, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR. You even look at the period of the long Ike boom and see a combination of public investment and private endeavor. So the city on a hill was built by government as well as by the private sector. And the long Ike boom, which probably lasted into the 60s, saw the Gini coefficient, and you all know what that is, falling to the lowest level in American economic history. So that from 1940, I think about 1946, 47, the Gini coefficient was moving in the right direction, and since 1968 it's been going in the other direction. And I sometimes wonder how American politicians get away with the fact that there is such an astonishing multiple of CEOs' pay to mean or average earnings. There is, I think, a lot of evidence that this is because people don't actually know what the figures are. They can't believe the figures if they're told. When asked, they think there's a multiple of 30. They don't know that there's a multiple 10 times or more than 10 times that size. So I think the levels of social inequity in the United States, and we've been moving in that direction in the United Kingdom, are becoming politically hazardous. And if I had to try to explain one of the reasons why, for the rage which helps to sustain Mr. Trump's ambitions, I would guess that social equity is a very big reason. I also think that there is a relationship between social equity and the sense people have that globalization is wrecking their prospects and delivering prosperity everywhere else except America. It's not, of course, true, but nevertheless there is that perception. And we have that in the United Kingdom as well. The sense people have that they want to get the world and get off, stop the world and get off, that they want control over their own lives in a mythical way, which has never really existed, and certainly hasn't existed during fast periods of globalization, either in the 19th century or in the last few years. In the United Kingdom, in the last few weeks, we've seen the near demise of our steel industry. Why? First of all, because of the dumping of cheap steel by China, which is producing about half the total amount of steel in the world, and which saw an increase in its steel production of 300% between 2008 and last year. The British steel industry has, in terms of its competitiveness, has been completely screwed because of that. So who's suffering? Not just the workers, but an Indian company which owns the British steel industry. So when people talk about controlling their lives so that they can protect their jobs and their children and their families' living standards, that's not the world we live in anymore, even if it has been for the last few years. And I would wish that people were making the case for free trade, fair trade, but free trade, were making the case, the positive case for globalization, more effectively and more toughly than they are. It seems to me that the real, one of the most important things, really the most important thing we should be doing in response to the competitiveness of globalization is investing more in our public education and in the improvement of our public education system. In my own country in particular, investing in further education. We've always been really bad at any vocational education, particularly in comparison with Germany. So I think social equity is an important part of this, but only part of a broader nexus of issues which touch globalization as well. Good old Eisenhower.
Well, it's interesting, like in Europe, they often refer to nowadays as the Juncker curse around politicians know what to do, they just don't know how to do it and get re-elected. So now that you're a crossbencher, and I believe you've referred to yourself as a liberal internationalist these days as opposed to just a Conservative MP, how do you think about commentary that politics is increasingly orchestrated, politicians are caught up in opinion polls and going to focus groups to guide them as to what to do next, and balancing the need to be responsive to the electorate but not just reactionary, and being able to deliver a manifesto to address some of the issues that you just raised?
I don't see any point in going into politics unless you've got strong views about things. And one of the things I find infinitely depressing is politicians who have to ask a focus group what they should be concerned about, and then ask another focus group how they should explain their concerns about whatever the first focus group has told them should be bothering them. And one of the reasons why I've found, I'm not making a political pitch, I suppose I am really, one of the reasons why I've found President Obama such an attractive human being is he does seem to me, when he's talking about events which really matter to him, like his own identity and the relationship between his identity and the culture and political culture in which he has to operate, you get the sense that this is not something he's had to ask somebody how to express. I mean, I thought the two speeches he gave, the one speech he gave in his pastor's church before the 2008 election about race in politics, and the speech he gave a few months ago after the slaughter of some African-American worshippers in a church in the South, those speeches were astonishingly powerful, because that was him, because that wasn't some other guy with the yellow legal pad writing the words down. It was authentically him. So if you don't have strong views about what society should be like, I mean, become a chartered accountant and make some money. I mean, but or a venture capitalist.
Readjust.
You can still have very strong views, but I don't see the point in going into politics unless you really feel passionately about one or two issues. What most worries me, well, what would most worry me if I was an American citizen, I think, is the extraordinary power of big money in politics. I mean, I shouldn't mention names, but you know the sort of people I'm talking about. And quite how the Supreme Court can define spending huge amounts of untaxed loot on supporting partisan opinions, partly because they suit your own business interests, how they can define that as covered by the Freedom of Speech Amendment, I simply don't comprehend. I was very impressed by Justice Scalia's intellect, but that seems to me what, to use one of his phrases, what he would have called pure apple sauce. And the sooner there is a Supreme Court which reverses that decision, I think the better for American democracy. Those of you who are historians of America, which I'm not, may regard what I'm about to say as too simplistic, but it always seemed to me that the majesty of the American political system was balancing a constitution which established a republic, not necessarily a democracy, with a political system which is democratic. And in order to balance the two, in order to make the checks and balances of the first something other than vetoes on action, you do need to have the ability to compromise, to make consensuses, and so on, which seems to me to be something for the Smithsonian these days. When I first got involved in politics, it was in a mayoral campaign in New York in the 1960s, when the Republican Party in New York was led by Senator Javits, Senator Keating, Nelson Rockefeller, and John Lindsay. Can you imagine what the Tea Party would make of that these days?
So if we think about the political actions which you're best known for, it's the last colonial governor closing the final chapter on the good old British Empire. So when we look back, in terms of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, it seems that you had remarkable clarity as to how you'd make progress towards a 97 deadline. And you stuck with it and had courage of your convictions despite great outrage from Beijing at the time. I think they cursed you to 1,000 years of hardship.
The sentence was remitted subsequently, but it's been
an
reinstated, I think,
in,
given what I've been saying about students in Hong Kong, but that's not the matter.
And even, you know, some of the former Brits who are out there weren't supportive, and then the stock exchange collapsed. And what gave you that courage to go on despite the naysayers and follow through on the actions?
I've always felt most comfortable in politics when, and forgive me if this sounds a bit sanctimonious, when I've thought that what I was doing was not only the right thing to do, but right. And it seemed to me that we had made promises to people in Hong Kong which we were creeping away from. About a month or 6 weeks before I left Hong Kong, I was visiting as governor a hospital for the mentally ill. And it was in a series of sort of low bungalows, each of them fenced in with a sentier, with a passage through the middle. And I'm walking along, and a very, very well-dressed Chinese chap in a three-piece suit, grey suit, and wearing, I think I remember, a Homburg, starts calling to me from behind one of these fenced enclosures. Governor Patten, he says, and to the horror of my staff, I walked across to talk to him. And he was incredibly polite. It's always lethal when people are polite. And he said, Governor Patten, can you explain this to me? He said, you very often, you and other British colleagues talk about Britain being the oldest democracy in the world. I nervously agreed. So he said, well, could you explain this to me? Why is it that you're handing over the last British colony to the last great communist tyranny in the world without ever consulting the people about it? So here was the sanest man in Hong Kong who was in a hospital for the mentally ill. Now, there was actually no alternative but the transfer of sovereignty in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, or most of Hong Kong, had been only taken on a lease, and the terms in which both the lease had been negotiated and the grant of the rest of of Hong Kong had been made were clearly matters of 19th century history, which nobody would seek to justify in the 20th or 21st century. It was a period when Western powers, not least the United Kingdom, were trying to globalize China by opening it to the opium trade. I mean, this is not something that even Queen Victoria found particularly attractive. So we had no alternative but to hand Hong Kong back to China. But we'd undertaken with the Chinese agreement that Hong Kong would be guaranteed that its way of life, due process, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, rule of law, and so on, would carry on for 50 years after 1997. And to be kind to China, it may be that there were conceptual difficulties. Let me give you an example. I got excessively praised for rather limited things I did on democracy because I was operating within very strict agreed guidelines. But I was trying to ensure that elections were at least free and fair. And one of my critics, who was a spokesman for Beijing, actually a perfectly nice chap, said to me, "You don't seem to understand our position. We're not at all against free and fair elections. We just want to know the result in advance." And I realized at that point that we were not going to have an easy way of connecting, of reaching agreement. And I sometimes actually think that it is quite difficult for people with my sort of background, small L liberal, pluralist, and so on, to really understand that Chinese communist mindset. I don't necessarily say Chinese mindset, because you can think of lots of Chinese communities which are profoundly liberal and pluralist. What's I think been a worry about what's happened subsequently is that those in Hong Kong who feel primarily Chinese also want Beijing to understand that they feel that they're Hong Kong Chinese, that they have a sense of citizenship which may not be as powerful as their sense of Chineseness, but in terms of the complexity of their identity, it's really important. And to some extent, trampling that underfoot, as their crudest Beijing has done recently, I think since President Xi's arrival, I think that's been really counterproductive. I mean, I went with my wife to an Oxford alumni gathering in Hong Kong this time last year. No, this time 2 years ago. I was coming out of receptions and meetings, and there would be 100 or 200 students, a lot of them who had hardly been born when I left Hong Kong, singing Rule Britannia and God Save the Queen. And I mean, it was terrific for my reputation in Oxford, I can tell you. But you could understand how provocative it would have been to the governing authorities in China. And that's their fault. It's really unnecessary and silly that they've provoked that sort of reaction. But I have huge respect for the students who were demonstrating 18 months ago for democracy with the most extraordinary politeness and good manners imaginable.
So it's interesting that you've been involved in conflict resolution across continents, also most notably in the Balkans, as well as Northern Ireland, and as a development officer with the Ethiopia and Sudan. It seems that you're very good at bringing all parties to the table and giving an incentive, most notably with the Balkans, encouraging regime change by suggesting membership of the EU. How do you think through this kind of carrot and stick approach to resolution? And are there any common takeaways you can share with us as to progressing discussions in the heat of the moment and moving things forward?
I've become obsessed over the years with identity politics and how lethal identity politics can be. I've worked in Northern Ireland, I've worked in the Balkans, I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in Asia. And the extent to which when people identify themselves with a very simple, pure-blooded set of loyalties, when that turns into a facility to imagine that they're being victimized, when their rather crude and simple sentiments are whipped up by demagogues, it nearly always leads to disaster. The most difficult job I did was after the Good Friday Agreement, which, to Tony Blair's credit and Mo Molam's credit, they managed to negotiate. The one thing that nobody could agree about was policing. The police force in Northern Ireland at the time was regarded as an arm of a Protestant state. Northern Ireland was probably 53%, 52% Protestant and 47-48% Catholics. The police force was 93% Protestant and 7% Catholic. And that was plainly not something that could survive in a new Northern Ireland. Resolving that issue involved doing a lot of things which were politically very difficult. But it seemed to me that these were corners you couldn't cut. You actually had to face up to the difficulties of changing names, of changing symbols. And we did that. And at the time, there were roars of disapproval from the Ulster Unionists, but it's lasted. And one result is that today, the police service in Northern Ireland is pretty well 30-35% Catholic and the rest Protestant. I mean, it's been a real transformation. So first of all, I think you have to stand up to the rougher side of identity politics. Secondly, you have to provide a political context in which people can extract themselves from the corners of rooms they've painted themselves into, or get off hooks. Something I used to get annoyed about when negotiating with Chinese interlocutors. They were always saying to me, but you've got to understand, we've got face. You've got to learn to save, we need to have our safe face. And I used to say to them, I've got bloody face too. You've got to understand other people have face which needs to be taken account of. When I was a European Commissioner, Mr. Aznar, the then Prime Minister of Spain, pretty tough fellow, asked to see me because he'd heard that I'd worked in Northern Ireland and he was reading across to the situation in the Basque countries and the terrorism of ETA. And he wanted to know what I thought should be done about policing in Spain in order to help undermine ETA. And I went into my spiel about the political background in Northern Ireland and what we'd done on issues like housing and local government and education and job creation. And I could see him sort of glazing over because I didn't have a simple, hard socket to him response. So there's always there's always a context which you've got to try to create, but ultimately you actually have to stand up to the worst sort of identity politics. There's a fantastic book. Well, there's a very good book on identity politics by Amartya Sen. There's another very good one by a French novelist called Armin Malouf, who's won the Goncourt and several other prizes. I think his main novel was called The Rock of Tarnos. Armin Malouf was actually born in Lebanon, Arab, Christian, writes in French, now lives in France. And he's written a brilliant book about the complexities of identity. You think about your identities, I've thought about mine. Irish, lower to middle class, Catholic, Tory, what my Irish forebears would have thought about me being a colonial governor. But they were. My great-grandfather was born in Ireland in 1829, left Ireland during the famine. So we all have these complicated identities ourselves. And Malouf says at the end of his extraordinarily tough, acerbic attack on identity politics, says that normally when you're a writer, you hope that in the future your grandsons, granddaughters will take books off the shelf and think, oh, this is a wonderful book. Gosh, did our grandfather really write this? He said his hope was that when his grandson took, I think this book is called The Pursuit of Identity, or The Question of Identity, takes it off the shelf, he'll look at it and think, my goodness, did people have to write books about this in those days? So it's a tall order, but I hope that identity politics is something we can start to eliminate, even while comprehending the complexities of other people's identity and the importance that other people should have an identity which is respected and is given the dignity it deserves.
So on the topic of shaping identity, you later went on to be the chairman of a media review for the Pope. Now, considering that they announced their election results through smoke signals, I'm not quite so sure how one goes about reviewing their digital media policy and coming up with Twitter and so forth. But can you talk a little bit about how that came about and the effect you think it's had and the drive and reach it's achieved?
Well, the message, the invitation was, of course, brought by Dove.
Carrier pigeon, no?
Carrier Dove, yes. I was quite surprised to be asked to do it, but jumped at it. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I'm a huge admirer of this Pope, and I'm what would be regarded as a fairly liberal Catholic. I don't think the Archbishop of San Francisco would have much truck with some of my opinions. So a great admirer, and thought that it was a pity that a man who was probably the best communicator in the world had a pretty, to put it mildly, archaic way of communicating. I mean, the budget in the Vatican when we started work was pretty well 92% spent on a newspaper, the Osservatore Romano, and on radio. And we all know that most people are getting their information on television and social media. So actually, even from that sort of fundamental point of view, there was a lot to be done. I had a very good team, including a brilliant social media expert who just happens to be an ex-banker, but now a member of the Dominicans, a great French priest called Eric Salobert. I had a very, very good group of others from outside, two excellent women, a German and a Spanish. And we put together a series of proposals, which the Pope, which His Holiness accepted, and established a team of Italians to implement. So I hope it's there was no footnote to that observation. But I hope it goes well. It's very important that it should. I mean, to be fair to the person who's leading this team, he's been head of Vatican Television for a long time, and the technical competence of Vatican Television is extraordinarily high. But it does matter, and it particularly matters that people are getting the sort of social media messages which they require. When I want to know with the time of Mass, I look it up as I would look up trailer for films. I mean, it's and I think most people are like that, and they're slightly surprised when they can't get the information that they want. He is a remarkable man, and we must all hope he survives. I used to have my meetings in the Santa Marta, which is the hostel that he lives in. And one day we'd had a meeting and we were having lunch, and it was his birthday. This would have been December 2014, I suppose. And he's sitting with cleaning ladies and the laboratory attendants and the cooks having his birthday lunch. And I said to the very nice Irish priest who was looking after me that it was a terrific sight. And he said, yes, you haven't heard the best of it, though. He said as his Pope mobile was crossing St. Peter's Square, he was stopped by a group of Argentinian pilgrims with a bowl of that herbal drink mate, which some of you may love. I'm not saying I prefer a dry martini. Anyway, he's handed the mate and takes a great swig out of it, and his detectives, his bodyguard, says, "Holy Father, you must never do that. You must never take a drink from people in the streets. It could be poison." So the Pope had replied, apparently, "What's the matter?" He said, "They were pilgrims, not cardinals." So we must hope he survives.
So I think with that, I'll turn to the audience for questions. And I believe we have a couple of microphones roaming around. Celine, I don't know if we have a question from Twitter to start.
We'll start with a question from Twitter. So a lot of us have worked with very different managers, but what was it like working with the Pope and the Queen?
Different sexes. I must say just one point on that, which is not irrelevant. When I first went to one of the Pope's private masses, I said to my secretary, a priest, how does this differ from what it would have been like under previous popes? And he said, easy. He said, there are women on the altar. The Pope, I'll tell you one similarity, and I don't want to be accused of lèse-majesté, either in its ecclesiastical form or its corporal or its less spiritual form. They're both quite simple and straightforward. Neither of them remotely grand. When you go, when I had conversations with Pope Francis, when it was business, it would be one-on-one or one with an interpreter, because my Italian isn't as good as it should be. No other people around in a simple, rather a dreary little waiting room in the Santa Marta, not sort of lots of purple and scarlet and sashes and berettas and so on. Similarly, when you see the Queen, she's perfectly normal and straightforward. Starts the day, as most of us do in Britain, listening to the BBC Radio Today programme, and she is what you would have expected of somebody born in the 1930s, yeah, just, or 20s, no, 20s, English, well, British, upper class. And she's got all the, she starts with those opinions which have been modified over the years by the number of prime ministers she'd seen come and go and the number of members of the public she's met. The extraordinary thing is that for somebody of her age, how enthusiastically she goes about her public duties. Having had to do a bit of that as a colonial governor, it can be pretty boring, and she never gives that impression at all. So, what they both exemplify is a very old-fashioned virtue, which I hope exists. I mean, I've done some jobs in business, but I hope exists in business, or it should exist in everybody's life. Makes things easier. They both have a sense of duty and obligation. And maybe if only as citizens, that's something which we should feel. So, yeah, they're perfectly normal to deal with, and quite funny.
That's great.
Queen has a very good sense of humour.
So next question.
Hi, Not Patten. Thank you so much for your enlightening speech today. My name is Ni Yong. I'm a second-year MBA student. I had a question regarding, since you're a Tory, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about how the recent release of the Panama Papers would have on the Cameron government. And also, given that you spoke very eloquently about social inequity, looking back at the previous few governments, the prime ministers, the deputy prime ministers, Nick Clegg, David Cameron, Tony Blair, they all belong to the Oxbridge elite. And do you think that kind of social stratification is going to continue going forward? Second question is, if you were able to talk to President Xi right now.
I think we'll just start with those. That was already two just there. So if we start with those two pretty meaty questions.
Well, let me deal with the second one first. It's true that there are a huge number of British prime ministers and ministers and members of parliament and judges and senior executives and editors of newspapers of left, right and centre. Huge number of people who run things in the United Kingdom who went to Oxford and Cambridge. And why is that? The reason is that Oxford and Cambridge, along with Imperial and UCL and King's College London, are the best universities and the toughest ones to get into. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the people who go, look, it's true very largely in the United States. It shouldn't be a surprise that the people who are smart enough to go to the toughest universities go on to get to the top in other careers. I think we have an establishment which is overwhelmingly meritocratic. It's overwhelmingly based on competence rather than connections, though connections can come into it. But I'm nowadays described by the popular press as a Tory grandee. My mother, who was not unknown to be a bit of a, it's unfair to say social climber, but she liked to think that she was cut off a slightly classier block. My mother would have been delighted to hear me called a Tory grandee. Here I am. My dad was a professional drummer in a jazz band. We lived in a semi-detached house in a part of London suburbs which was on the margins between lower and middle class. I went on a scholarship to secondary schools. I went on a scholarship when I was 16 from my secondary school to Oxford. I'm a scholarship boy, and I found myself in my life doing jobs surrounded by other scholarship boys. Now, it is true that David Cameron is an old Etonian, but his predecessor was a Scottish grammar school boy. His predecessor was at a rather grand school in Scotland. His predecessor, John Major, left school at 16, and his father sold garden gnomes. His first job interview was to become a bus conductor, and he was turned down. His predecessor was Margaret Thatcher, whose father ran a grocery and was a scholarship girl. Her predecessor, I could go on, as leader of the Conservative Party, was the son of a small building merchant. My wife used to stay with some friends in the town where he worked, and whenever the lavatories were blocked, they'd send for Ted Heath's father. So I think we're a much more socially mobile society, and it's not surprising that people from what are the most difficult universities to get into finish up doing some of the toughest jobs. But what is incredibly important for any meritocracy is to ensure that it recognizes that there are even broader ladders behind it in order to let people climb up them. What's incredibly important for people like me and others is to recognize the role of the state in helping us up the ladders, and to recognize that the state is still required to help people from poorer and more disadvantaged backgrounds to get onto the ladder and to rise up it. So I think meritocracies have to be benign and sensitive to the interests of those who are coming after them if they're going to justify themselves. On the Panama Papers, the Prime Minister, this has been all happened since I've been away, but as I understand it, his father had established a trust for from which his family benefited when he died, as well as other people benefited. I don't think anybody has suggested it was a way of evading tax or covering up the billions that you'd earned, as was the case with Mr. Putin, for example. And I think I'm right in saying it's the sort of trust which, if you're an American citizen, you don't have to go to Panama to set up, because there are at least 2 American states where you can do it anyway. I read Fareed Zakaria this week on why there were no American names in the Panama Papers, and his argument was, well, you don't have to do that if you're an American. I think undoubtedly Cameron will suffer from a bit for people being reminded that he was a rich toff. And I'm not quite sure how long that lasts, and I regard wealth envy as one of the less pleasant aspects of living in a democracy.
So, Lord Patten, I have the privilege of asking the last question, and you wrote a book, What Next, for the 21st century, and that's kind of a question that many of us, especially second-year students here, asking ourselves. So what are the big problems that you see that some of us should put our minds to start solving for, or what pearls of wisdom would you like to share with us to close?
I sent a copy of my book, What Next, to the then Chancellor of Cambridge University, who was the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's husband. And he was then well into his 80s. He's now well into his 90s. And he sent me back a handwritten reply saying, what next, ? When you're my age, there's only one answer.
I think he's probably got a...
What next? I tell you what I find surprising, and I think it's going to be the sort of key, a sort of nodal issue in the next few years. Most of us understand, most of us recognize intellectually that very few of the problems that weigh on our societies, very few of the problems that confront our societies can be dealt with by individual countries. And yet, at the same time, the enthusiasm for international cooperation to tackle those problems has waned significantly. So whether you're talking about epidemic disease or international economic issues, trade, or environmental issues, or trafficking human beings, or trafficking guns, none of those issues can be tackled unless there is cooperation. And while that is true, the support for shared sovereignty, for shared policy making has declined significantly. And I think it's a real problem. I think here in the United States, you have a difficulty that the Republicans believe in free trade, but not in the institutions which are necessary in order to sustain it. And the Democrats believe in the institutions, but not in the free trade. And I think there are similar problems in other countries. So I think reigniting a belief in international cooperation and international institutions to give credibility and legitimacy to that cooperation, I think that is hugely important and should be invested with a degree of hope which doesn't at present exist. I think one of the things that universities, great universities like this one, should do, exist to do, is to provide hope. At the end of one of the most remarkable books about international relations I've read, Henry Kissinger's book on diplomacy, which was written in the mid-1990s. Whatever people think about Henry Kissinger's record in government, he's an extraordinarily fine historian. And he's written, Diplomacy is a book about the post-war settlement, the great contribution of the United States to the world after 1945, with some help from Europe. The way that had brought peace, certainly in Europe, for a longer period than anything since the Congress of Vienna. And he writes at the end about how that's shaking to pieces, the point I've just made. And he quotes an old Spanish saw, an old Spanish proverb: "Traveler, where is the road? Don't ask where the road is. Roads are made by walking." Mm. And I think it's the role of universities to do some of the walking and to show us where the roads are. And I can think of no better or more important a task for universities or for university teachers or for university students. The last thing you should do at a university is think that it's somewhere where you can go to be safe or protected from the world. If I can make one last controversial point, I think it's an oxymoron to talk about universities and safe spaces in the same breath. I think universities are all about challenge and finding those roads which will get us from one predicament to another, because that's what being alive is all about.
That's a delightful note on which to end. We'll all go out and walk and chart our own path. So please join me in welcoming and thanking Sir.